Imagine a fiercely independent clan of horsemen living by their own rules on the wild grasslands of the Dnieper River. These men were the Zaporozhian Cossacks, Orthodox warriors who cherished freedom and faith above all. In their own eyes, they were not just soldiers, they were the living spirit of Ukraine's soul. To them, pledges were to God and their brothers, not to distant kings. But empires looked at them and saw rebels. Over centuries, the fate of the Cossacks became a battleground of empires. Welcome back to the deep chapter where every fall hides the seed of a new beginning. Now, let's get into it.
The free spirit of the Cossacks. The Cossacks were like the cowboys of Eastern Europe. Formed from runaway peasants, adventurers, and even minor nobles, they built their lives in the untamed steppe, outside any king's control. The name Cossack comes from a Turkic word meaning free man, and that was their motto. They pledged loyalty only to their elected councils and to Eastern Orthodoxy. Their shared faith was the bond that held them together. To join their ranks, one had to accept the Orthodox faith. For the Cossacks, religion and independence were inseparable. Even kings in Warsaw or Istanbul knew that to win them over meant respecting their church. In their fortress republics like the famous Zaporizhian Sich, rich and poor ate together and had a voice. Imagine a town meeting where any man can stand up in council and challenge the hetman's orders. That was their democracy on horseback. Every Cossack was trained with both plow and saber. They lived like a constant storm on the horizon for enemies and like a shield for the weak. On holy days, they prayed together in wooden churches, sharing folk songs and stories of saints and battles. Their enemies accused them of being barbaric. But these were people who built villages and raised families under the cross. All this made them legendary, admired by friends and feared by foes. One famous episode. In legend, they once wrote a notoriously obscene reply to an Ottoman sultan, a prank immortalized by artist Ilya Repin in an 1893 painting. True or not, the tale shows their spirit. Quick humor and open defiance. Key point. The Zaporozhian Cossacks were fiercely independent Orthodox warriors, organized as their own republics. Freedom and faith were at their core, a legacy still honored in Ukraine's national anthem and symbols. Rebellion and the search for allies by 1648, all that free living reached a crisis. Don Khmelnytsky led the Cossacks and many Ukrainian peasants in a massive uprising against the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. Amazingly, they drove Polish armies out of much of Ukraine. By year's end, they had taken Kiev and other towns, founding a Cossack hetmanate with its own hetman army and parliament. For the first time, these Orthodox Ukrainians governed themselves. They issued charters, collected taxes, and negotiated truce after truce. But this new state was fragile. Polish kings struck back, Tatars raided, factions divided. Khmelnytsky even signed a shaky peace, the 1649 Treaty of Zaborov, that pleased no one. The Cossacks enjoyed a taste of independence, but knew it might vanish overnight. It was like lighting a candle in a stormy night. Momentarily warm light, but the wind could extinguish it at any second. Khmelnytsky realized he needed a stronger ally. He first tried the Ottomans and Crimean Tatars, but those alliances kept collapsing. By January 1654, he did something bold. He sent envoys to the Tsar in Moscow. In the town of Pereyaslav, they met Tsar Alexia. They struck a deal. Russia would protect the Cossack hetmanate, and in exchange, the Cossacks would swear loyalty to the Tsar. It was like asking a powerful neighbor to be a bodyguard. Khmelnytsky probably thought this was a temporary marriage for survival. The Cossack officers entered Moscow with cheery letters and promised fidelity. But the fine print held dangers, as the years would show. The Treaty of Pereyaslav 1654 promised Russian military support for the Cossacks in exchange for an oath of loyalty. It was meant as an alliance to keep Ukraine safe, but it also tied Ukraine's fate to Russia. The Treaty of Pereyaslav, hopes and consequences. Khmelnytsky had hoped for security. Russia was the great Orthodox power, so he assumed the Tsar would respect their faith and freedoms. For a moment it worked. Russian troops helped repel Polish and Tatar attacks, and the Cossacks raised their hats in gratitude. But soon the arrangement soured. Tsar's officials began to treat Ukraine as just another province. They interfered in Cossack elections, dictated taxes, and even claimed a say over the church in Kyiv. By 1686, the Ukrainian Metropolitan was forced. Under the Moscow Patriarchate, a decision made without Cossack consent, every step was a blow to their autonomy. To the Tsars, Pereyaslav was a victory. They even added Little Russia to the Tsars' title, treating Ukraine like part of the empire. They proudly told stories of two Russlands united under one crown. But to many Ukrainians, it felt more like a trap. It was like trusting a big friend with your savings only to have your wallet slowly emptied. Some chroniclers claim Khmelnytsky took the oath only under duress. A desperate move for survival, not a voluntary union. Over time, what was meant to protect Ukraine became a legal reason for Russia to meddle in its affairs. Key point. In practice, the Pereyaslav Agreement put Ukraine under Moscow's wing. Although meant to preserve autonomy, it gave Russia a legal pretext to dominate Ukrainian affairs. Over the following decades, that pretext only grew stronger. Little Russia. The weight of a name as Moscow's control tightened. It rebranded Ukraine. The phrase Malorussia, or Little Russia, came into official use. This implied Ukrainians were just a smaller branch of the Russian family. In fact, the idea dates back centuries. In 1361, the Orthodox Patriarch set up two provinces in Rus called Great Rus Moscow and Little Rus Kyiv. At that time, it was just church bureaucracy. Centuries later, after Pereyaslav, the term took on a different life. Russian emissaries began calling the Ukrainian lands Little Russia, a younger sibling of the empire's core. This relabeling was more than semantics. Russian schoolbooks began teaching that Ukrainians were Little Russians, one part of one nation. Claiming a separate Ukrainian culture or language was painted as betrayal. In the 19th century, authorities banned Ukrainian language books in schools, saying the language was no more than Russian with a twist. For ordinary Ukrainians, being told they were little was infuriating. It was like calling someone born in Texas an East Texan instead of an American. By the late 1800s, Ukrainian thinkers had started to push back, insisting Ukraine was a distinct country with its own name and history. Slowly, the proud name Ukraine, meaning borderland, came back into use, and Little Russia became a relic of empire. Key point. Calling Ukraine Little Russia was an imperial tactic to deny Ukrainians a distinct nation. It implied they were just a junior part of Russia, a notion Ukrainians increasingly rejected. From friends to foes. The Cossacks under the Tsar at first, the Cossacks stayed loyal to their new overlord. They even sent regiments to fight in Russia's wars, thinking this service would protect their autonomy. But they discovered a harsh truth. In Moscow's eyes, a loyal ally might as well be a subject. Governors and generals in Ukraine started to ignore Cossack councils. They put Cossack taxes into Russian coffers, dictated who could travel, and asserted the right to appoint hetmans. It was like inviting a friend over and finding he had changed your house rules. The breaking point came during Peter the Great's wars. Peter demanded Cossack troops but refused to defend Ukraine itself from invaders. Feeling abandoned, Hetman Ivan Mazepa switched sides during the Battle of Poltava 1709, allying with Sweden for true independence. Russia won that battle decisively, and Peter took cruel revenge. Towns that supported Mazepa were destroyed, and thousands of Cossacks were executed or exiled. The message was clear. Loyalty under Peter meant danger. Finally, Catherine the Great delivered the coup de grace. In 1764, she simply abolished the hetmanate. Its laws and council vanished overnight. Remaining Cossack leaders were absorbed into the Russian nobility, with pensions but no power. Then on June 2, 1775, Catherine sent troops under General Peter Tokali to the Zaporizhian Sich, the last free Cossack fortress. The Sich was caught unprepared. Most warriors were away fighting the Ottomans. Russian cannons roared, the Cossacks surrendered, and Russian soldiers razed the Sich to the ground. Centuries of Cossack self-rule had ended in a single night. Key point. Over time, the Russian Tsars systematically dismantled Cossack self-rule. By 1775, with the Sich destroyed and autonomy abolished, the last independent Cossack state was crushed. Broken empires, today's echoes. Centuries later, the battle of narratives continues. In Moscow's telling, Ukraine has always been part of one Russland. President Putin has repeatedly declared that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. and called Ukraine's modern borders a mistake of history. He even wrote that Ukraine is an artificial state created by Lenin. These claims echo exactly what the old Tsars said, blaming foreign intrigue for any Ukrainian aspirations. In Ukraine today, people hear a very different story. School children are taught that Ukrainians have a continuous national identity from Kievan Rus through the Cossack era, interrupted only by foreign rule. Heroes like Khmelnytsky are seen as founding figures of a Ukrainian state, not as joiners with Russia. In 2018, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church formally split from Moscow, restoring the church independence the Cossacks once had. Politicians and activists emphasize a civic identity that spans all regions and languages of Ukraine. For ordinary Ukrainians, these narratives collide in daily life. Surveys since 2014 showed that an overwhelming majority, even in Eastern, Russian-speaking regions, identify as Ukrainian first. The old idea of one people has lost its power. In practice, when some leaders in 2014 proposed renaming parts of Ukraine Novorossiya or Malorossiya, Ukrainians on the ground rejected those labels outright. In short, Russian assumptions that enough Ukrainians would quietly welcome reintegration proved wrong. The people have chosen their own path. The long history of treaties and renaming is still being debated. Russia insists on historical unity, while Ukrainians increasingly insist on their separate nationhood and statehood. Identity on the battlefield. In early 2022, this centuries-old struggle turned deadly. Russia invaded across multiple fronts, openly questioning Ukraine's right to exist. Russian leaders called Ukraine a fake state and insisted its people were really Russians who had forgotten their roots. For many Ukrainians, this felt like a challenge to everything their ancestors had fought for. The response was swift and fierce. Ukrainians of all backgrounds, from Lviv to Donbass, took up arms with a unity reminiscent of the Cossack republics. Soldiers and volunteers openly invoked the Cossack legacy. One infantry unit nicknamed themselves the New Zaporozhians, and even local school teachers armed themselves with harpoons and wreaths like modern-day Cossacks. Flags with blue and yellow and Cossack symbols flew everywhere. The old patriotic slogan for Ukraine, for freedom, Artizi, became the battle cry. Russian propaganda tried to revive historical arguments, but on the ground they rang hollow. Ukrainian civilians dug in, as if defending another Sich. They built checkpoints, rallied local defense units, and dug trenches in city streets. In Kyiv's suburbs and Odessa's streets, people painted Cossack phrases and songs on walls. Every time invaders raised a Russian flag, locals tore it down and replaced it with Ukraine's flag. The centuries-long identity struggle reached a climax. Russian appeals to history largely failed. Ukrainians reaffirmed their distinct nationhood in action, much like the old Cossack republics did in their day. In the end, it was the side with the stronger sense of identity and freedom that held firm. Freedom's enduring legacy. From Khmelnytsky's uprising through the sack of the Sich, each turn in the Cossacks' history taught Ukrainians a lesson. Freedom cannot be bought or imposed. Treaties and labels came and went, but the idea of self-rule endured. Today's Ukrainians carry those lessons with them. They know that real nationhood is decided by the people, not by emperor's documents. The term Little Russia is now a relic. Ukrainians choose their own identity and proudly call themselves Ukrainians. The Cossacks wrote the first chapters of this story, and modern Ukrainians are writing the next ones on streets and in history books. Empires may draw borders and change names, but a nation's soul belongs to its people. As the poet Taras Shevchenko wrote of the Cossacks, they once cherished freedom and great glory. Ukrainians today draw inspiration from that heritage, knowing that only they can decide their fate.
The Cossacks carved their place in history with fire and faith, dreaming of a free steppe where no king or empire could chain them. Yet in seeking protection through the Treaty of Pereyaslav, they walked into the embrace of the Russian Tsar, trading one master for another. From that moment, the term Little Russia began to overshadow Ukraine's own name, planting a wound in identity that still bleeds today. And this was only the beginning of a struggle that would define centuries to come. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. The deep chapter continues. See you in the next chapter.